He bought a warehouse for 25 cents, then found a cradle no one claimed. The auction lasted 4 minutes. The building looked worthless, its walls cracked and the roof sagging like the tired shoulders of an old man. It was the kind of place forgotten by time, left to rot in a town where progress moved at a crawl. Boone Carter raised his hand just once, offered a single quarter, and the echoing silence was his only competition. No one outbid him. The auctioneer, a man with sweat stains on his collar, seemed relieved to just be done with it. He hammered the gavel down like he was killing a snake. 3 days later, Boone walked into his new property, expecting nothing more than dust, cobwebs, and the smell of decay. He kicked the door open, and a shaft of afternoon light cut through the gloom, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten things. He walked deeper into the cavernous space, his boots crunching on debris. And that's when he saw it. In the farthest, darkest corner, tucked away beneath a sheet of rotted canvas, was a cradle. It wasn't just any cradle. This thing was a work of art. The wood was dark and rich, hand-carved with a skill you didn't see anymore. Every joint was fitted with a precision that spoke of love, of hours spent hunched over, getting it just right. Someone had spent weeks, maybe months, building this. Someone had poured their heart into it, dreaming of the child it was meant to hold. But here it sat, abandoned in a place no one cared about, covered like a secret someone wanted to bury, but couldn't bring themselves to destroy completely. Boone ran his fingers along the smooth, worn wood. He could feel the ghost of a lullaby in its grain. Then his fingers caught on something. He leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. Letters. Carved deep into the headboard, elegant and sure. The initials were clear as day. N.C. He didn't know it yet, but those 2 letters were about to unravel his quiet life. He thought he'd bought a worthless building for a quarter. What he'd really bought was a 28-year-old mystery, steeped in lies and desperation. A mystery that was about to come knocking on his door. The next day, he decided to ask around. This was a small town. Someone had to recognize those initials. He went to the general store first, a place that smelled of coffee beans and sawdust. The woman behind the counter, Martha, had lived there for 40 years. They said she knew every family, every birth, and most of their secrets. Boone sketched the initials on a scrap of paper and slid it across the counter. Martha glanced down at the paper, and her friendly smile just vanished. It wasn't a look of confusion. It was recognition, followed instantly by a decision. The decision to lie. Her eyes darted away, fixing on a shelf of canned peaches behind his shoulder. "Never seen 'em before," she said, her voice a little too quick, a little too high. She busied herself wiping down a counter that was already spotless. Boone thanked her and walked out, but he paused by the window. The second he was out the door, Martha scurried into the back room. Through a gap in the curtain, he saw her talking to someone, her hands moving in frantic, urgent gestures. She wasn't just lying, she was scared. Next, he tried the blacksmith, a barrel-chested man named Gus, whose hammer blows were the town's heartbeat. Gus looked at the initials, and his jaw tightened so hard a muscle jumped. He didn't say a word. He just turned back to the glowing horseshoe on his anvil and brought his hammer down with a force that felt like pure anger. Clang. The sound echoed off the walls. Clang. Louder this time. Boone stood there for a full minute, the ringing in his ears, before the blacksmith finally spoke, his voice a low growl, never looking up from his work. "Some things are better left buried, Carter. You'd do well to sell that warehouse and move on, before you start digging up roots that are holding this whole town together." Boone left, the blacksmith's warning hanging in the air. One person lied, another gave a threat. He had one more stop to make. The doctor. Doc Miller was an old man with kind eyes and steady hands that had delivered half the town's population. Surely he'd be straight with him. The doctor looked at the initials longer than the others. He held the paper like it was a fragile thing, his brow furrowed in thought. It was like watching a man wrestle with his own conscience. "Where did you find these?" he asked, his voice quiet. When Boone told him about the cradle, hidden away in the old Ellsworth warehouse, all the color drained from the doctor's face. It wasn't shock. It was dread. A deep old dread that had been sitting in his gut for years. "Listen to me," the doctor whispered, leaning forward. "Burn it. Burn that cradle and don't ever mention it again." His voice shook with the same tremor Boone had heard in Martha's. Then, before Boone could even ask why, the doctor stood up, walked to his office door, and closed it in his face. The click of the lock was deafening in the sudden silence. Boone walked back to the warehouse, the afternoon sun feeling cold on his skin. 3 people. 3 identical reactions. Fear, lies, and a desperate plea to destroy the evidence. This wasn't just a secret. It was a wound the entire town had conspired to keep from ever healing. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't see her. Standing at his warehouse door, a woman was waiting. She wore a dress that was worn thin and mended in a dozen places. Her hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin on her face. She looked like a person who had spent a lifetime carrying a weight that never got lighter. When she heard his footsteps, she turned. Her eyes scanned his face, then darted past him to the warehouse door, searching for something. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked on the first word, as if it had been lodged in her throat for years. "My name," she said, her voice a raw whisper, "is Nellie Callahan. The cradle in there. It's mine." Boone unlocked the warehouse door and let her in. The moment Nellie Callahan's eyes fell on the cradle, she froze. It was like she'd been turned to stone. Her hand flew to her mouth, and for a long, silent moment, she didn't even seem to breathe. Then she started moving toward it, each step slow and painful, as if she were walking on broken glass. She reached the workbench, and her fingers trembled as they touched the wood, tracing the curves her own hands had once carved. She followed the lines of the initials, NC, and a sound tore from her throat. It wasn't a sob, it was something more primal, the sound of grief that had been locked away for a lifetime finally breaking free. Boone gave her space. He'd learned a long time ago that some pain is too big for words. He stood by the door, watching her shoulders shake as she clung to the cradle like it was a life raft in a storm. When she finally found her voice, it was rough and broken. "I made this," she whispered, her cheek pressed against the wood. "I carved those letters 28 years ago." She told him she was young then, alone, waiting for a child she never got to raise. She said the baby, a girl, was born on a bitter winter night. She'd been working at a tavern, living in a small room upstairs, with no husband, no family, just the promise of a daughter. She'd spent 3 months building that cradle, teaching herself how to work the wood, her hands bleeding from the effort. She carved the initials into the headboard so her daughter would always know she was wanted, that someone had built something beautiful just for her. But the baby came too early. She delivered alone, with only a midwife who looked at her with a mix of pity and judgment. "The baby was perfect," she said. 10 fingers, 10 toes. But hours later, they told her the child was sick. She needed a doctor, medicine, things Nellie couldn't afford. They took the baby to a local hospital. Nellie, still weak from the birth, followed, carrying the cradle because it was the only thing she had to give. Later that night, they told her the baby had died. A fever, they said. Too small, too weak. They wouldn't let her see the body. They told her it was better this way, better to just move on. Heartbroken, she left the cradle at the hospital, unable to bear the sight of an empty bed built for a future that had been stolen from her. Boone listened, and he felt the truth in her pain. But there were holes in the story. Big ones. She said it was 28 years ago, but the wood of the cradle, the way it had aged, it looked older, closer to 40. And the way she described the hospital, so clean and efficient, it didn't sound like the kind of rough and tumble clinic that would have existed in this isolated town back then. He asked her for the name of the hospital. She hesitated, and in that tiny pause, Boone saw the first crack in her story. She gave him a name that sounded generic, made up. When he asked for the doctor's name, she changed the subject. She claimed she'd been searching for the cradle for 28 years, hearing rumors it ended up in this warehouse. But if that was true, why wait until now? The warehouse had been abandoned for ages. Why show up just 3 days after he bought it? And the way her hand shook when she touched the initials, it wasn't just sadness, it was fear. Boone looked at this woman, with tears streaming down her face, and he knew 2 things for sure. She was telling the truth about loving the child this cradle was for, but she was lying about what happened to her. And whatever that real story was, it was so terrifying that she'd spent nearly 3 decades running from it. Boone let her cry for another minute. Then he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Nellie," he said, "tell me the truth." He asked her again for the hospital's name, for the doctor's name. He asked her why she'd only shown up now. Nellie's tears stopped. Not slowly, but all at once, like a switch had been flipped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, and the eyes that looked back at him were no longer soft with grief. They were hard, calculating, the eyes of a survivor. "I lied," she said, her voice flat. "I lied because the truth is worse, and I was afraid you wouldn't help me if you knew." She pulled a dusty chair close to the cradle and sat down, her hands never leaving the wood. Then she began to talk again, and this time, her voice carried the unmistakable weight of truth. The baby hadn't died. That was the first and biggest lie. They had told her that, made her believe it, so she would go away quietly. But her daughter had been stolen. The so-called hospital, she explained, was run by a man named Milton Ellsworth. The same man who had owned this warehouse. He wasn't a doctor. He was an administrator, a man who kept the books, a man who knew which families in the region were desperate for a child and had the money to pay for one. And he knew which girls, like Nellie, were poor, alone, and had no one to stand up for them. Milton had built a system, a cruel, efficient market for human beings. He'd find pregnant, unwed women, deliver their babies in secret, and then tell the mothers their child had died. Before the grieving mother could even process what happened, the healthy infant would be gone, placed with a wealthy, childless couple who paid Milton a fortune for a new baby and a forged birth certificate. It was a perfect crime, preying on the most vulnerable and selling to the most desperate. A cold sickness spread in Boone's stomach. He'd heard whispers of such things in big cities, but never here, not in a place so small you couldn't sneeze without your neighbor knowing. He asked how she found out. Nellie said it took 15 years. 15 years of piecing together whispers, rumors, and fragmented stories from other women who had lost their babies in the exact same way. Women who were told their children died, but were never shown a body. By the time she understood the truth, the trail was ice cold. Milton had closed his operation and sold the building. The families who'd bought the children had moved away or blended in, raising sons and daughters who had no idea they'd been stolen. She had tracked the cradle because it was the only thing she had left. The only physical proof that her daughter was real, that she had been loved before she was taken. She'd heard a rumor that Milton had kept it, stored it away in this warehouse with other things he couldn't bring himself to burn. Now Boone understood. He understood why the townspeople were so afraid. They knew. Maybe not all the details, but they knew Milton Ellsworth was a powerful man with a dark secret. He understood why Milton himself had come, demanding the cradle be destroyed. It wasn't cursed. It was evidence. evidence of a crime that could still shatter the life he'd built. He asked Nellie the question that hung in the air between them. "Do you know where your daughter is?" Nellie shook her head, and for the first time, Boone believed her without a single doubt. She'd spent years searching, but Milton had covered his tracks too well. All she knew was that somewhere out there, a woman was living a life that wasn't hers, a life built on a crime. And Nellie had spent 28 years trying to find her. Boone stood there, the whole sordid story settling on him like a shroud. But before he could even think about what to do next, he heard them. Heavy boots on the gravel outside, moving fast. The warehouse door, which he'd left ajar, swung wide open. Milton Ellsworth stood there, his face a mask of cold fury. And behind him stood two other men, big men, the kind of men you hire when you want to make a point without saying a word. Milton's eyes went from Nellie to the cradle, and finally to Boone. His voice was low and dangerous. "You have 48 hours, he hissed. "Get rid of that cradle, and get out of my town. If you don't," he said, taking a step inside, "things are going to get very, very ugly for you." Boone didn't move an inch. He looked at Milton, flanked by his hired muscle, and he felt a choice crystallize inside him. He could do what they all wanted: burn the cradle, leave town, and go back to his empty life. Or he could stay. He could stand his ground and see what happens when you push back against a man who has gotten away with the unthinkable for far too long. Nellie rose from her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the cradle's edge. She stared at Milton, her face a storm of fear and rage that had been brewing for nearly 3 decades. "Milton!" she spat, and his name sounded like a curse. Milton took a step toward her, his hand raised, but Boone moved faster, placing himself between them. "Why do you care so much about an old piece of furniture?" Boone asked, his voice calm but steady. "If it's just wood and memories, why bring 2 friends with you?" The question hung in the dusty air, and Milton's silence was a confession. He wasn't afraid of the cradle. He was afraid of the truth it held. Milton's face flushed a deep, angry red. "You don't understand what you're messing with," he snarled. "There are good, respectable families in this region. You'll destroy their lives for what? To satisfy this woman's delusion about a child that's been gone for decades." "She's not gone!" Nellie cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "You told me she was dead, but she's not. Her name is Florence, and she's out there living a life you stole from us." The name hit the air like a physical blow. Florence. Milton's eyes widened for a split second, a flicker of pure shock before he could mask it. But Boone saw it. He saw the recognition. Nellie wasn't just guessing anymore. She knew her daughter's name, and Milton's reaction proved she was right. One of Milton's men shifted, his hand moving toward his belt. Boone saw the outline of a club. Instantly, Boone's hand shot out, not for a weapon, but for the cradle itself. He lifted it off the workbench, holding it like a shield. The weight of it surprised him. It felt as heavy as all the secrets it carried. Milton stumbled back, his anger suddenly replaced by panic. He pointed a trembling finger at the cradle. "You have no idea what you're protecting," he shrieked. "There are people who paid for privacy, for a chance at a family. They deserve to live in peace, not have some beggar woman show up claiming ties you can't even prove." "I bought this warehouse for 25 cents, Boone said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone as he set the cradle back down. "That means everything inside is mine, including this. If you wanted it gone so badly, you should have burned it yourself years ago, Milton, instead of hiding it like evidence you didn't have the stomach to destroy." Milton's hands clenched into fists. For a heart-stopping moment, Boone thought the old man was going to lunge, but one of his men placed a hand on his shoulder, murmuring something in his ear. Milton gave a single sharp nod, his face tight with controlled rage. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. He looked back at Nellie, and his expression was no longer just angry. It held a strange, twisted kind of pity. "Florence Lockwood has a good life," he said, his voice dripping with venom. She's married to a wealthy man. She's respected. You show up claiming to be her mother, you'll destroy everything she believes in. Sometimes, he added, a cruel smile touching his lips, the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them keep living the lie that makes them happy. And then they were gone. The sound of their boots faded, leaving a thick, ringing silence behind. Boone and Nellie stood there, the cradle between them. And Boone knew. That 48-hour deadline wasn't a threat. It was a countdown. A countdown to when Milton would stop talking and start ensuring their permanent silence. Nellie's voice was a bare whisper. Florence Lockwood. She lives 3 towns west of here. She'd known the name for 6 months, she admitted, but she hadn't had the courage to go. What words do you use to tell someone their entire life is a lie? Boone looked from Nellie's desperate face to the initials carved with so much love and hope. He made his decision. We have less than 48 hours, he said. Let's go find your daughter. If you're finding this story as gripping as we hope, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you these tales of the Old West, and your support means everything to us. They left before the sun was even a rumor in the sky. The cradle, wrapped carefully in canvas, was secured in the back of Boone's rickety wagon. Nellie sat beside him, clutching a small cloth bag. It contained everything she owned, a change of clothes, a few coins, and a letter she'd written years ago. A letter to a daughter she'd never met. The road west was unforgiving. Flat, easy grassland soon gave way to rocky hills that shook the wagon until their teeth rattled. For the first few hours, Nellie was silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if she could will her daughter into view. Boone let her be. He understood that sometimes the most important preparations for battle happen in the quiet of your own mind. As the sun climbed, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, she finally began to talk. Not about Florence, but about the girl she used to be. She was 17 when she got pregnant, working in a tavern where men's compliments felt more like threats. The father was a ghost, a man passing through whose name she'd forgotten, but whose mark on her life was permanent. She'd been terrified, but underneath the fear was a flicker of hope. This child, she thought, would be the one thing in her life that was truly hers. The one thing no one could take away. She'd been wrong. Boone listened, the rhythm of the horse's hooves a steady beat under her painful story. He found himself telling her about his own loss, about the fire that had claimed his wife and daughter 8 years ago. He told her how he'd been in town for supplies, how he'd seen the smoke from miles away and rode like a madman, only to find silence and ashes. He'd stopped building things after that. A man who buys a warehouse for a quarter isn't making plans for tomorrow. He's just trying to survive today. That's why you helped me, Nellie said softly, looking at him with an understanding that went beyond words. You saw that cradle, and you recognized the shape of what was lost. He couldn't deny it. He saw his own daughter's empty bed in the grain of that wood. They stopped at midday. Nellie barely ate, her eyes constantly drifting to the canvas-wrapped shape in the back of the wagon. What will you say to her? Boone asked gently. How do you even begin a conversation like that? Nellie shook her head, her expression haunted. I've rehearsed it 1,000 times in my mind. None of it sounds right. How do you tell a woman you're her mother when she already has one? A mother who raised her, who loved her? How do you ask her to believe her whole life is a lie? As evening approached, they crested a hill and saw a small settlement below. Nellie pointed to a large house on the eastern edge, with a sprawling corral and land that stretched out toward the rocky hills. That's it, she whispered, her voice trembling. The Lockwood place. They pulled up outside the property just as a woman walked out of the house. She was tall and confident, with dark hair pulled back from a face that had never known hardship. She saw the wagon and stopped, her expression shifting from curiosity to a guarded caution. Nellie made a small, choked sound, like the air had been punched from her lungs. Tears were already streaming down her face. In a voice thick with 28 years of heartache, she whispered, "That's her." Florence Lockwood set down the basket she was carrying and walked toward them, her posture radiating a calm authority. She stopped a few feet away. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. Nellie climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady. She took a few steps toward Florence, her hands twisting the fabric of her worn dress. "I know this is strange," she began, her voice cracking, "but I need to talk to you about something that happened a long time ago." Florence's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm sorry. I don't know you. You must have me mistaken for someone else." She began to turn away, dismissing them with a finality that brooked no argument. "Hospital!" Nellie cried out, the single word sharp and desperate. Florence froze, her back still to them. Boone could see her shoulders tense. She turned around slowly, her face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. "What do you know about a hospital?" she asked. And now there was a flicker of something new in her voice. Fear. Nellie took another step forward. "I know you were told you were born to the Lockwood family, but it's not true. It was a lie. You were stolen from me." Florence's face went white. "Get off my property," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing, but you need to leave, now." "I built a cradle for you," Nellie pleaded, tears now flowing freely. "I carved my initials in it. For 28 years, I've been searching for my daughter. I've been searching for Florence Lockwood." "Stop it!" Florence shouted, backing away toward the house. "My parents were good people. They loved me. You're insane." She turned and fled toward the safety of her home. "Wait!" Boone called out. He moved to the back of the wagon, pulled off the canvas, and lifted the cradle. He carried it forward and set it on the ground between them. "Before you decide she's lying," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "you should take a look at this." Florence paused at her doorstep, her hand on the knob. She looked back, and her eyes fell on the cradle. A strange expression crossed her face. Not recognition, but something deeper. A flicker of a memory so buried it was more feeling than thought. She walked back down the steps, slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal. She knelt beside the cradle, her gaze fixed on the headboard. Boone pointed. "Look at the initials." Florence stared at the letters, NC, carved so lovingly into the wood. Her hand went to her own neck, her fingers fumbling with something hidden beneath her collar. She pulled out a thin silver chain. On it hung a small tarnished locket. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside, folded into a tiny square, was a yellowed piece of paper. She carefully unfolded it. At the bottom of a short, faded message were 2 initials. NC. They were a perfect match. Florence looked up at Nellie, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying understanding. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How do you know about this? My mother, the woman who raised me, she gave this to me before she died." It was Nellie's turn to be stunned. She stared at the locket. "She gave that to you?" Florence nodded, her whole body shaking. "When I was 16, she was sick. She knew she was dying. She gave me this and told me. She told me if I ever felt like something was missing, if I ever wondered about where I came from, I should look for these initials." Her voice broke. "I never understood what she meant. Until now." In that moment, Boone understood everything. Florence's adoptive mother had known. She had known her daughter was stolen, but she had loved her too much to shatter her world with the truth. Instead, she had left her a key. A key to a door she hoped Florence might one day be ready to open. A dam of emotion broke inside Florence. She looked from the cradle to Nellie's tear-streaked face, and 28 years of lies crumbled around her. There were always things, she sobbed. The way people in town would look at me. The way my father would change the subject when I asked about my birth. The way my mother cried on my wedding day. It wasn't joy. It was grief. I'm so sorry, Nellie whispered, reaching out but not daring to touch her. I never wanted to take away the family that raised you. I just needed you to know. I needed you to know you were wanted. You were loved from the very beginning. Florence stood up, her back to them, her shoulders shaking. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice muffled. Do you expect me to just erase my life? To accept all of this? I don't expect anything, Nellie said softly. You can walk away. I've already lost you once. But before Florence could answer, they heard it. The thunder of hoofbeats, fast and hard, coming down the road. Boone turned. 3 riders, heading straight for the property, and leading them, his face a thundercloud of rage, was Milton Ellsworth. The 48 hours were up. Florence saw them too, and something inside her snapped. The grief on her face was replaced by a cold, hard fury. She looked at Nellie. Is that him? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Nellie nodded. He's the one. Without another word, Florence strode to the cradle, lifted it in her arms, and carried it to her front porch. She set it down in the middle, a clear, defiant declaration. Then she turned back to Boone and Nellie, her eyes blazing. If Milton Ellsworth thinks he can ride onto my land and intimidate us into silence, he has no idea who he's dealing with, she said. My husband is in the back fields with 2 of our hands. I'll get them. She ran toward the back of the property, her voice calling her husband's name. Boone moved to stand beside Nellie as the riders thundered into the yard. Milton swung off his horse before it had even stopped, his face contorted with rage. He strode toward the porch, his eyes locked on the cradle as if it were a venomous snake. What is the meaning of this? Florence's voice cut through the air like a whip. She stood on her porch, her husband, a tall, formidable man, now at her side, a rifle held loosely in his hands. 2 more armed men stood behind them. That cradle is stolen property, Milton sputtered. The only thing stolen here, Florence shot back, her voice ringing with newfound conviction, is me. She told her husband everything, the words pouring out of her in a torrent. The cradle, the locket, the lies, the story of a mother who had never stopped searching. Her husband's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He looked at Milton with a dawning horror, as if seeing the man for the first time. Nellie walked right up to Milton, her small frame radiating an immense strength. Admit it, she said, her voice quiet but powerful. Admit what you did. You didn't help anyone. You built a life on stolen children and broken hearts. Milton looked around at the ring of hostile faces, at the rifles pointed in his direction, and he crumbled. The decades of lies collapsed under the weight of the truth. He tried to justify it, stammering about poor women and rich families, but no one was listening anymore. Get off my land, Florence commanded, her voice like steel. I'll be talking to the sheriff in the morning, and then everyone in this territory is going to know what you did. Defeated, Milton turned and rode away, a smaller man than the one who had arrived. Boone watched him go, a profound sense of justice settling over the yard. Florence turned to Nellie. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, a mother and daughter separated by a lifetime of crime. Then, Florence stepped forward and wrapped her arms around the woman who had given birth to her. Nellie clung to her, and the sound of her weeping was the sound of a 28-year-old wound finally beginning to close. When they finally pulled apart, Florence asked Nellie to stay. I'm not ready to call you mother, she said, her voice thick with emotion. That name belongs to someone else, but I want to know you. Nellie nodded, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. I'll stay. she said. For as long as you want me. Boone left 2 days later. He rode back to his warehouse, the 25-cent building that had changed everything. It felt emptier now, but his own heart felt fuller. He hadn't just uncovered a secret. He'd helped mend a family that had been broken by greed and cruelty. He had given a mother back her daughter, and a daughter back her truth. Sometimes justice doesn't come from a judge or a jury. Sometimes it comes in the form of an old wooden cradle and the courage to demand the truth, no matter the cost. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep these stories coming. If you'd like to support us even more, consider leaving a super chat. Your contributions help us continue bringing you powerful stories from the Old West that explore the depths of human resilience and justice. Every bit of support means we can create more content like this, and we're grateful for each and every one of you who chooses to be part of this journey with us. Thank you for watching.